Your Honor, opposing counsel, members of the jury, there was no bribe. October of 2014, the Gambling Commission announced that they would be accepting proposals for a new casino in the state of Midlands. And a casino owner, the Black Bear casino owner, Avery Bancroft, decided to jump on this opportunity. So she submitted a proposal along with two other singers. Now, those were Shannon Stark, a professional poker player, and J.C. Longstreet, an ex-owner of a theme park. I'm sorry. These two proposals were the only ones submitted. And Mr. Covington had about 7 months to go through these proposals. In the end, it came down to experience. And Mr. Covington voted for Avery Bancroft. Members of the jury, it is the prosecution's allegation that Mr. Covington accepted a bribe for that vote. That's not true. Because from all the evidence we heard today, which witness could tell you that there was an actual exchange? And members of the jury, none of them could. That's because there was no bribe. Now, for the prosecution to meet their burden, they had to prove 3 elements, and all of them beyond a reasonable doubt. Members of the jury, when I say beyond a reasonable doubt, I mean using common sense and rational thinking, that if you found that Mr. Covington didn't meet all 3 of those elements, then you cannot issue a verdict of guilty. The prosecution brought 3 witnesses before, and these witnesses were used to try and help prove their burden. Their burden was that 1, Chase Covington is a public official. Members of the jury, I just want to clarify, that is not something the defense contests. He is the chair of the Midlands Gambling Commission, and that makes him a public official. That's his job. Along with that job comes responsibilities. And the prosecution is alleging that he did not follow those responsibilities. To prove that, they had 2 other elements. And the first is that Mr. Covington received something of value in exchange for his vote. And lastly, that he had the intent to be persuaded in the performance of an official act. Members of the jury, the prosecution, the state, couldn't prove that burden. Because ultimately, it's a fantasy, a conspiracy, and something nowhere close to the truth. See, the prosecution twisted their tale to fit the crime. But members of the jury, there was no bribe. They called to you Corey Hyde. Now that is Avery Bancroft's executive assistant. And Ms. Hyde testified on the stand today that she saw Avery Bancroft loading what she thought was around $200,000 into a black briefcase. A black briefcase that Ms. Bancroft herself ordered. Now, Ms. Hyde couldn't tell you what she did with that briefcase. Ms. Hyde couldn't tell you why she had that briefcase. Ms. Hyde couldn't tell you if Mr. Covington ever touched that briefcase. Members of the jury, Ms. Hyde testified on the stand that then Avery Bancroft won the casino proposal the day after that she saw this. But it wasn't just Mr. Covington that voted for Avery Bancroft's proposal. Ms. Hyde told you that there was another person to vote for Avery Bancroft's proposal for the majority vote. Now, secondly, they called Mr. Denny Hoy to the stand. And Mr. Hoy talked about a lot of these camera feeds that he was watching on the day of the 16th. He told you that he saw Ms. Bancroft and Chase Covington walk into the casino with black briefcases. Mr. Hoy also told you that he couldn't distinguish the differences between those briefcases. He can't actually tell us, and he didn't actually tell us, which one is which. He couldn't tell you which one was Avery Bancroft's and which one was Chase Covington's. He couldn't tell you that they switched briefcases. They couldn't prove the 2 elements that they had to prove. And that's because, members of the jury, there was no bribe. Lastly, they called Ms. Sikorsky to the stand. Now, Ms. Sikorsky is a forensics expert. Now, she talked a lot about the briefcase that was picked up with Chase Covington on the 19th when he was arrested. Mr. Covington came to the stand and talked a lot about that briefcase, that he only touched the handle. And members of the jury, that completely backs his story. Ms. Sikorsky told you all about how there was fingerprints only by Chase Covington on the handle and Avery Bancroft, but nowhere else on this briefcase. The only thing Ms. Sikorsky could tell you, or Mr. Sikorsky could tell you, is that they both came into contact with this briefcase. That's because it was Avery Bancroft's briefcase, and Chase Covington did touch it. Now, the defense called witnesses as well. And we called these witnesses to put your minds, members of the jury, at ease. Because we called Ali Thomas to the stand. Ali Thomas talked about the day of the 16th. The day the state alleges this bribe occurred. She was working this middle table. And it was at the 16th of April that Mr. Covington and Avery Bancroft sat down at this table with briefcases. Now, she also talked a lot about how these briefcases were set under the table, out of her view, but far apart enough that they couldn't grab each other's briefcase. Ms. Thomas told you how she didn't see any evidence that would suggest Ms. Bancroft grabbed Chase Covington's briefcase, or that Chase Covington grabbed Ms. Bancroft's briefcase. Nowhere in this evidence could suggest that either of these briefcases were switched. All the witnesses today told you that they couldn't tell you whether or not these briefcases were switched. Now, lastly, we called Chase Covington to the stand. Mr. Covington talked a lot about his bank statement and an email exchange. And I want to talk about that bank statement. We saw that $200,000 was deposited on the 17th of April. Members of the jury, this $200,000 was not the bribe that the government suggests. See, Chase Covington explained to you that he had a vacation home in Tahiti that he was bidding on. First, he took out $155,000 in March, and later $200,000 more. And when he did not win that, he then put it back into his bank account. The prosecution only brought to you 17 days of his bank statement. Nowhere did they see March bank statement, just 17 days of an April bank statement. The prosecution has failed to bring you evidence that would suggest he committed a bribe, because, members of the jury, there was no bribe. Now, they also talked about how Chase Covington had taken this brief. This was Chase Covington's briefcase, and Avery Bancroft. Chase Covington's DNA evidence was in this briefcase, and it was Avery Bancroft's. But members of the jury, when we talked to Sikorsky, he had to be reminded that it wasn't Chase Covington's evidence in this briefcase. It was Avery Bancroft's. And it was also Avery Bancroft's briefcase, not Chase Covington's. Chase Covington clarified on the 19th of April at the ceremony, he reached down to leave and grabbed the wrong briefcase, one he usually grabs, as he is a businessman. He is a public official. He has sensitive documents he must protect so that no one else can see them. Thank you. Find him not guilty.
Go to give rebuttal.
Yes, sir.
How much time's left on the rebuttal?
There is 3 minutes and 15 seconds.
Okay, go for it.
There was no bribe, is what defense is saying. However, there was $200,000 deposit the day of the acceptance of the new proposal. There was blind spots that existed. And must I remind you that Chase Covington has a simple government job. Where else would this large amount of money come from? We didn't need to give you more or less than 17 days. We just needed 1 day to prove to you that there was a bribe that has been accepted. Now, speaking of rationality that defense has earlier stated, isn't it rational to think that there are briefcases filled with DNA, there were several meetings, there was a witness, Bancroft's witness, that actually testified and told us that she has seen Bancroft herself place large amounts of money into a briefcase, and then right after that, $200,000 appear in Chase Cummington's bank account the day of the proposal. Now, nobody here is saying that Bancroft's proposal was a bad one, but that's not what we're arguing here today. We're not arguing whether it was a good proposal or a bad proposal. We're arguing why this was the outcome. We're arguing why Chase Cummington accepted that proposal and signed off on it. And the reason is Chase Cummington wanted more money, received more money, and accepted a bribe. The pieces are all there for you. It's rational to see how all of them fit together. Deal or no deal, we can evidently see that a deal has been made.